Breaking news this evening is Gary Lineker has been told to step back from hosting Match of the Day until he and the BBC have, and I quote here, agreed a clear position on his use of social media. So no Lineker on Match of the Day. About 5 or 10 minutes after that news broke, Ian Wright put out on social media that he would now, as a show of solidarity, will not also be presenting Match of the Day. This tweet from Alan Shearer has just appeared on Alan Shearer's timeline. It says, I have informed the BBC that I won't be appearing on Match of the Day tomorrow night. So, Match of the Day tomorrow night will not have the host, Gary Lineker, and Alan Shearer and Ian Wright. And I assume more will follow. Let's stay with this story, obviously, as we speak to talkSPORT's very own Simon Jordan to get his view. Hello, Simon. Good evening to you.
Hi, boys. How are you?
Hi, Simon. We are good. I'm sure you're across this. Firstly, I suppose the obvious question is, what's your view on it all?
Well, the National Health Service, in the same way that national broadcast has been politicised. So here we are in that space. But there are very clear guidelines. There is an element of impartiality that's required from their presenters. Some would argue that Gary Lineker is a freelance presenter. He's only really a freelance presenter because he chooses to use a service company and ultimately get the tax benefits of it. So he's bound by the same covenant as everybody else. He's made an observation. People like Alistair Campbell can pop up with their particular political leanings and suggest it's assault on freedom of speech. But we're in a space where the broadcaster has very clear outlines and very clear perspectives, and it's an observation on a political policy. We know Gary Lineker's political leaning. We know Alistair Campbell's political leaning. You cannot align yourself to a criticism of a political policy if you're an employee or engaged in a very influential position with the BBC. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Gary Lineker is fortunate to be in a position where he's been given an opportunity to realign his social media positions. Other people may not have been put in that position. Other people may have been shown the door.
Simon, he's come out and he said that he's obviously not going to apologise and he stands by his tweet. What do you think that means for him going forward then?
Well, he shouldn't apologise because he either means it or he doesn't mean it, does he? You can't have the courage of your convictions and have no skin in the game. Too many times in football, people stand up for something, and when it means any sacrifice, they stand down again. We saw all that nonsense in the World Cup when people wanted to wear armbands, and so it affected them. So here we are. Lineker said what he meant. He meant what he says. So by definition, he's prepared to fall on his sword. One of the benefits of it is we get a far more insightful Match of the Day tomorrow about listening to Ian Wright's drivel.
Oh, that's not fair. We love Ian Wright, Simon. We love Wright.
Good for you.
Listen, okay, on that subject of co-host, right? So we know that Wright is not doing it. He went on social media about half an hour ago, give or take, and said, I'm not doing it now. As I read 2 minutes ago, Alan Shearer has now said that he will no longer be taking part in Match of the Day until further notice. What does that do? How much pressure do you think are on the rest of the pool of co-hosts that the BBC have got for that role?
Well, none whatsoever. If they subscribe to the same view as Gary Lineker, then they're entitled to have their view on it. You must remember that Gary Lineker, in part, is in a position where he can leverage the enormous influence that he has. Millions and millions of followers have, in part, a significant part, been built on the fact that he's a BBC-related person. And in line with that, the BBC have very clear policies. If you want to make it a divisible line and you want to stand in solidarity behind something that you all believe, I'm not entirely sure these boys subscribe to that view, but if they feel they want to have solidarity with Brother Lineker, that's up to them. But the other guys that may want to do it, they then subsequently shouldn't be vilified. Different people in this country have very different views. Lineker has his, and the consequences of his are that he's fallen foul of a very clear policy.
Sorry, let me ask you then, playing devil's advocate here, there have been other people that have been employed by the BBC, Lord Sugar being one of them, that have put their political views out on social media and yet still remain employed by the corporation.
Well, that depends upon the structure of how he's engaged with them. The production company that produced for the BBC perhaps is very different than the production company that does Match of the Day. I'm not entirely sure of what Alan Sugar has and hasn't said, so I can't speak to that specifically. But by definition, there should be an element of the same standards applying. But let's not get into whataboutery. No one's making Gary Lineker a victim. Gary Lineker has pointed out some very unfortunate and very clumsy language relating to something that offends not only people's sensitivities from a certain persuasion, but also it makes political commentary. So all in all, I think it's very clumsy language. But I'm not going to get into whataboutery, what Alan Sugar may or may not have said, because I'm not specifically aware of what he has and hasn't said.
Simon, let me ask you, do you see any scenario there where Gary Lineker doesn't come back from this?
Well, he's got to realise, listen, if he wants to be a martyr for his own cause, I admire him for it. If he's so convinced and so committed to the cause of making his opinion prevalent and expressing his views and using his influence, then he'll take the relevant consequences. Most of the people in and around this industry don't have that sort of courage of their convictions, so I imagine he'll realign himself with the guidelines that the BBC put in place. If he doesn't, he'll go up in my estimation because he'll take the consequences of refusing to realign himself. All we've got at this moment in time, guys, is a step back. Lineker's positioning himself, saying, I won't be told what to do. I've got a freedom of speech issue. We've all got freedom of speech. Everyone's got freedom of speech. It doesn't come without freedom of consequence, does it?
Mm. Do you then side with both parties here? Do you agree with Lineker for standing firm, and you agree with the BBC for taking him off air?
Yes, I do. I listen, it's his view. He's entitled to his view. No one has the right not to be offended. He has a view. If that's his view, I don't particularly concur with it. I don't think it's particularly constructive. We are also talking about a BBC that's steeped in hypocrisy, because when they talk about impartiality, when the Brexit vote was going through, every single television show that was a Question Time or a Newsnight had 2 or 3 Remainers and 1 Brexiteer. So they are hypocrites. But notwithstanding that, I think the BBC, because they're being used as a political football by both sides, have got to stand their ground. And if Lineker believes in what he's saying, how can he not stand his ground?
Okay, just quickly, because I know you're a busy boy tonight, so I appreciate your time. How do you see this playing out? What will happen next?
I think they'll find some form of accord. I think there's too much to be lost on both sides. I don't think the BBC particularly want to sanction Gary Lineker. I think they've been forced into it by very, very pressurised media and political aspirations from various factions. I would expect that they'll find some accord. I don't expect him to apologise. I don't expect him to have to apologise. I expect him to sort of cease and desist with this going forward. And if he can't, and if he won't, then and only then will the BBC have to solidify their position. I hope for the national airwaves that he solidifies his position.
Okay. Last question to you, Simon. If they ran out of pundits, had no one left, and then they phoned you, would you go match of the day and be a pundit tomorrow night?
Not if you tied my tongue to the back of the bus and dragged me to the studios where I want to sit in Gary Lineker's chair.
Oh, no, I mean, it's a pundit, not as main host.
No, what for? I mean, Andy, don't you know this? I'm a former football chairman. We know nothing about football.
I've been saying that for years.
Simon, I know you have.
We love your work. You know that. I really appreciate you coming
Cheers,
on such
Simon.
a It's very kind of you. Thanks, man.
Yeah,
Have a good weekend.
Bye now.
There you go, the wonderful Simon Jordan.
How come one man knows so much about everything?
I just people can't see. Maybe if you're watching on YouTube, but Bentley's been there with a thesaurus for about the last 20 minutes.
Honestly.
talkSPORT Drive with Andy Goldstein. Monday to Friday afternoon from 4 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.